As I was preparing for this talk last week, a fellow Chicagoan, the President of the United States, delivered the keynote address at the gala dinner of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute in Washington, D.C. Addressing a large crowd that included most of the country's most influential Latino leaders, Obama invoked the spirit of Cesar Chavez to rally an audience frustrated by the long delays in achieving immigration reform. Earlier this year, the president said, I had a chance to host a screening of the film Cesar Chavez at the White House, and I was reminded that Cesar organized for nearly 20 years before his first major victory. He never saw that time as a failure. Looking back, he said, I remember the families who joined our movement and paid dues long before there was any hope of winning contracts. I remember thinking then that with spirit like that, no force on earth could stop us. I think it's great that the president finds inspiration in the legacy of Cesar Chavez, but it struck me as yet another indication of how important and timely it is to have this discussion about Chavez the man and Chavez the myth. Because the statement that Chavez didn't have a victory for nearly 20 years is not only inaccurate, it's misleading. Chavez had victories throughout his early career, some extremely significant. And it's not a problem only because the arithmetic is off. There's an important idea that is lost. Chavez, the great organizer, understood how crucial those early victories were to keeping his movement alive. I entitled this talk, Cesar Chavez, the Man, the Myth, and the Legacy, but I'm going to talk primarily about the man and the myths. In the course of that discussion, I hope some of his legacy should emerge more clearly. I'm also doing my first PowerPoint, so hopefully this will work. As Obama's statement underscores, Chavez the man and Chavez the myth have become over time so tightly braided together that separating the strands poses some real challenges. And to disentangle them constructively requires approaching the task with some delicacy, because to understand Cesar Chavez, one must see the myths as part of the man. We need to understand his role in creating his own mythology, why and how he carefully, deliberately, and crafted, nurtured, and spread the legends that fueled his iconic status and have come to be in so many spheres accepted as fact. At the same time, by probing those legends, and drawing on the extensive documentation that exists, much of which Chavez took pains to leave us, we can divine where historical events diverge from the stories that have been passed on for decades, and in doing so come to a deeper understanding of Chavez's place in history and appreciate why that history is important. Why it is important to understand that Chavez did have victories, small and large, from the time he first heard the term community organizer in 1952. This is a photo of him in his first incarnation as vice president of the community service organization in San Jose, when he wore suits and grew a mustache to look older, until he signed contracts with California's table grape industry some 18 years later. David Gutierrez, a historian who some of you know and for whom I have enormous respect and has been a big help and source of encouragement to me, cites an old Chinese proverb to describe the role of historians. The historian is the hand that rectifies. I've never actually been able to find the proverb, but I love the idea, and I've thought about and repeated it saying many times. I've always seen that as part of my responsibility to be the hand that rectifies, first as a journalist for many years, and then more recently as an independent scholar. In fact, as I was preparing for this talk, I remembered that in 1986, when I was covering New York Governor Mario Cuomo, the father of the current governor, who's then a hot presidential prospect, considered a great liberal savior, I wrote a cover story for Mother Jones magazine entitled 10 Great Myths About Mario Cuomo, which I might add was received about as well by Mario Cuomo as some of my work has been received by Cesar Chavez's family. But perhaps that goes some way to explaining why I, who am on paper a rather unlikely candidate, ended up as the first serious biographer of Cesar Chavez. By the time I tumbled down this rabbit hole in which I've spent most of the last 10 years, the myths around Chavez were firmly entrenched. They've been written into textbooks, taught in California schools, and repeated in scholarly work, often despite clear documentation to the contrary. Some are basic factual errors, others are major omissions or areas that are glossed over lightly. And there are two common threads in all of this: an unquestioning acceptance of Chavez's word as gospel, and a desire to present him in as saintly a light as possible, to to skip over problematic or controversial parts of his movement, and to steer clear altogether of his failures. The net result was that 2 decades after he died in 1993, there was still no biography of this remarkable leader. It was not for lack of understanding that his story was far more complex than the hagiographic portrayals that accompanied the postage stamps, murals, and ceremonies naming schools and streets. Many people were aware that there was more to the story, nor was the obstacle a lack of material to dive into in order to plumb that history. There are extraordinary archives, which I'll talk about a little more later. But for very human and understandable reasons, writers inside and outside the Academy who understood Chavez's significance and his complexity shied away from tackling the subject. Even a historian who was acutely aware of the importance of telling the unvarnished version of Chavez's story feared that doing so would alienate his college students. So when it came time to discuss Chavez in Chicano history classes, he said a few years ago in a panel discussion, quote, "I fudge it." I would submit that this was not doing the students any favors, and that in fact, this fear of tarnishing the legacy of the preeminent Latino icon has backfired, because people no longer know who he is, and those who have heard of him have only the faintest sense of what he did, even in California and the Southwest. For years, the standard line has been that if you say Cesar Chavez in the fields, farm workers think you're talking about the Mexican boxer. The makers of the Chavez biopic that screened at the White House discovered that this ignorance is far more widespread. And when you say Chavez on the East Coast, one of the promoters of the film told me, they think you're talking about Hugo Chavez. And on the West Coast, they think you mean the boxer. When Diego Luna, who was the producer of the movie, was promoting his film at South by Southwest, he stood on a street corner in Austin on Cesar Chavez Boulevard and asked passersby if they could identify who the street was named after. And it took about 6 people before anyone could get it right. At the screening of the movie before a large audience in Washington, D.C., U.S. Labor Secretary Thomas Perez lamented that people know Chavez had something to do with farm workers, but, quote, they can't really get to the next sentence. So that is really why I wrote this book, because those next sentences are nothing short of astounding, and it's important not to lose sight of that. With an 8th grade education, Cesar Chavez built the first successful union for farm workers and masterminded a national grape boycott that forced California's most powerful industry to sign contracts with its poorest workers. He changed working conditions in the fields and empowered poor people with a sense of their own strength. He trained a generation of activists who continue to pass on his legacy in social justice battles around the country. And then, driven by his own vision, the charismatic leader effectively destroyed the union he had built. I undertook this book because I became persuaded that the lack of serious scholarship about Chavez until quite recently was in part responsible for the fact that he was rapidly disappearing from our collective memories. And I also embarked on this project with the hope, which I think has been borne out by response to the book, that people are smarter and more forgiving than we sometimes give them credit for. That they can accept and even embrace a hero with imperfections and understand that heroes have flaws too. Hero derives from the Greek word, and to digress for a moment into a different kind of mythology, I think we need, as the American people, to return to thinking about heroes as the Greeks did. Greek heroes were the offspring of a god and a mortal. Divinity granted them superpowers, but mortality rendered them compelling. It is not the feats of strength, but their human struggles that made Greek heroes ever relevant and capture our imagination centuries after their tales were first told. Chavez, too, was a curious hybrid, and he embodied what might seem at first blush a great contradiction. Even as he created, nurtured, and perhaps even came to believe his own legends, he also went to great lengths to preserve an incredibly rich and detailed historic record. In 1967, a young archivist from Detroit, pictured here slightly older than he was at the time, named Phil Mason, traveled to Delano with instructions from UAW President Walter Reuther to make arrangements to preserve the history that was being made in the fields of California. And Reuther was an early and very key supporter of Chavez and the farm worker movement. Mason, who would travel to Delano at least once a year from then until the end of Chavez's life, arranged for the then new labor library at Wayne State University to become the official repository for the UFW archives. From then on, Chavez directed everyone involved with the union to send everything to Wayne State. And if you talk to people who worked for the UFW during that period of time, they will tell you that they boxed everything up and they sent it off to Wayne State. And at the library, which was later named after Reuther, there are still many of those boxes that have never been opened or even cataloged. And in addition to documents, Chavez saved tapes. He taped thousands of hours of conversations, lessons, conferences and meetings, and deliberations of his union. And I have a little visual aids here. So I spent quite a lot of time going through boxes that look like this, which were boxes of cassettes, and then there are boxes of reel-to-reel tapes. And for those here, of whom there are quite a few, I think, who might not know what that artifact is, that is a tape recorder, in front of which I spent many hours threading the reel-to-reel tapes. It was quite an adventure. But if Chavez's two impulses might seem contradictory, to create his own legends and to preserve a record that refuted those very legends, I think they're actually quite easy to reconcile. As an organizer, Chavez used the mythology to further his goals, but he understood that once he was gone, the myths would no longer serve that function. The next leader would have to invent his or her own mythology. Chavez was conscious of his historical importance. As an autodidact and an avid reader of history, he understood that his place in history would be assured through his actions, and he made sure that every footprint would eventually be unearthed and studied. He said he wanted his story told, warts and all, after he was gone. To circle back to President Obama's remarks last week as an illustration of this dichotomy, when Chavez would recount how the first members of his organization paid dues long before any contract was in sight, had they bought into the idea of their collective power decades before they triumphed, he used that story to inspire and empower those whom he was organizing. When a politician repeats Chavez's quote decades later, it lacks that power. Instead, today's organizers could learn from studying what Chavez actually did, how he built on the small victories and leveraged them to larger ones, how he practiced what he called organizational jujitsu, taking the opponent's strength and using it against them, and even how he created his own mythology. So I'm going to back up now in time and sketch very quickly the outlines of Chavez's early life, in order to be able to contextualize a few key junctures later on when he began to shape his story in his quest to build the movement in the face of truly formidable opposition. And that, by the way, is the actual tape recorder at Wayne State University, not just a replica. So Cesar Chavez was born outside of Yuma, Arizona on March 31st, 1927, and grew up in an adobe home, of which these are the ruins. There are actually less, this is an old picture, so there's even less left at the moment, but there still are sort of stone remnants that you can clamber out on. It was a ranch that his grandfather and namesake had homesteaded in 1901. And this is the actual, well, never mind. It's the actual deed of the homesteading, but it's not showing up very well, so we'll skip it. The property, his grandfather's property was in foreclosure almost from the time that Cesar was born. He attended this 3-room school, the Laguna Dam School, through 5th grade. And in 1939, after his grandmother died and the county sold the ranch at a foreclosure auction, the Chavez family joined the migrant stream and headed to California. He arrived in California just about a month after the publication of The Grapes of Wrath. So for those who are familiar with that book, that's the California that greeted him. His family traveled the circuit and worked in the field summers, and he worked in the field summers and weekends, although his mother insisted he stay in school through 8th grade. And that's his 8th grade graduation picture. After that, he went to work full-time in the fields, frustrated and angered by the physical demands, the humiliation, and the contempt with which the growers treated their workers. This is a photo of workers using the short-handled hoe, which Cesar used and his family used, and it was 18 inches. It was eventually banned, in part through the efforts of Chavez and the farm worker movement. And it was an instrument both of incredible physical hardship, but also sort of a form of psychological exploitation, because the growers could look down the rows and see if anybody stood up to stretch and order them back to work. So it came to symbolize both the physical hardships as well as the lack of respect and dignity for workers. At 19, Chavez volunteered to join the Navy and served a 2-year stint. Returning to what had become his family's home in Delano, California, he married Helen Fabella. That's a picture of Helen, started a family, and by 1952 was living in San Jose working in a lumber yard with his brother Richard. There, in June 1952, he met a man named Fred Ross. This is a photo of a slightly older Fred Ross, who was a founder of the Community Service Organization, or the CSO, which had formed a few years earlier in Los Angeles as a grassroots organizing group for Mexican Americans. The CSO held voter registration drives, English and citizenship classes, challenged second-class conditions in Mexican barrios and schools, and fought police brutality cases. Ross became Chavez's mentor and changed the direction of his life. Soon Chavez was working for Ross, work that was financed through Saul Alinsky and the Industrial Areas Foundation, whose archives are actually here in Chicago. This is a picture of the 1954 founding convention of the National CSO. The tall guy in the middle is Fred Ross. Alinsky is cut out of the picture here, and there's Cesar with his mustache and suit again. For the next decade, Chavez apprenticed himself to Ross and learned how to organize. It was an extremely critical decade for him, and thanks largely to Alinsky, we have a great record of Chavez's education and evolution as an organizer. Alinsky required his organizers to file activity reports, and Chavez wrote them faithfully, sometimes weekly, sometimes daily, often by hand when he did not have access to a typewriter. Not all, but many of them have survived and made it to the archives. In 1962, frustrated by the middle-class aspirations of many members and leaders of the CSO, and discouraged by the organization's inability to achieve a secure financial footing, Chavez set off on his own to organize farm workers in Central California. And I'll come back and revisit that key decision in a few minutes. The following 8 years represent this extraordinary trajectory. Chavez moved to Delano in April of 1962 and began traveling around the Central Valley, talking to farm workers one by one and in small groups, enlisting members in a new group which he called the Farm Workers Association. He conducted a census, and this was the explanation that he handed out of it, where he said he was just trying to get farm workers to register, and he didn't call it a union because the very idea of a union was so frightening to workers at that point in time. And he asked just 2 questions on his census. What should the minimum wage be in your opinion? And would you be interested in a newspaper that gave farm workers news of what was happening? And I would point to that also as kind of such an example of how visionary Chavez was as a leader, to have the idea when he was first starting out that farm workers, many of whom were monolingual, many of whom didn't read and write, would be interested in a newspaper, and that would be an organizing tool, and in fact, it proved to be a very successful one. So he starts in April '62, and within 5 months, he calls the first convention and of what became ultimately the United Farm Workers. They adopted the motto, Viva la Causa, to this day the motto of the farm workers, and the black eagle as the symbol of the union. 3 years later, when Chavez pulled his fledgling union out on strike in the table grape vineyards of Delano, the start of what became the 5-year grape strike, he was still virtually unknown. And 4 years later, he was on the cover of Time magazine. Perhaps the most iconic image from that period occurred in March of 1968, after Chavez embarked on the first of his lengthy public fasts. New York Senator Robert F. Kennedy, only days away from announcing his candidacy for president, traveled to Delano to help Chavez break his 25-day fast. The fast catapulted Chavez and La Causa into the national consciousness, giving him both an opportunity and an imperative to shape his story for a growing national audience. To help with that job, several key players entered the scene at that point, and they play important roles in popularizing Chavez's story. The writer Peter Matheson penned a 2-part series in The New Yorker that was crucial in establishing Chavez's credibility with an elite East Coast audience. And Jacques Levy, a reporter with a small paper in Northern California who had written stories about agriculture, hit on the idea of doing a Chavez biography. Levy, and that's Jacques Levy, Dolores Huerta, and Gilbert Padilla, 2 members of the executive board. Levy pitched the idea to Chavez shortly after the fast, and Chavez decided to cooperate. A wise decision. Levy was not a brilliant reporter, but he was a terrific stenographer. His work became instrumental in advancing both Chavez's national image at the time and his future legacy. Chavez, the charismatic leader who took great pains to control his image, had a willing disciple and scribe to help shape and embellish the stories in ways that might further the cause. And Chavez, the student of history, who wanted to preserve every shred of paper related to his exploits, had a willing disciple and scribe to help establish a detailed record for future generations to unearth. Because Chavez knew that Levy would write only the most glowing account, and because Chavez had the right to review and change the manuscript, Levy had rare and practically unfettered access to family and friends. He was privy to closed negotiating sessions. He spent many hours driving Chavez around the valley while the tape recorder ran. He traveled to Rome when Caesar and Helen met the Pope, and taped Chavez's recollections of the trip on the plane ride coming home. Chavez gathered his entire family together for a weekend, parents and 4 siblings, so that Levy could interview them at length and tape their recollections about growing up in Arizona and California. Eventually, all of those tapes and transcriptions ended up in the Beinecke Library at Yale. Many of the details of Chavez's life that have become accepted fact and part of his official biography first became popularized through Levy's book, which is called Autobiography of La Causa, published in 1974, in the form of first-person accounts by Chavez and close aides. That was how Levy wrote the book. The number of schools that Chavez attended as a child, for example, was wildly inflated, 37 in Levy's book. In fact, school records show that Caesar spent most of 7th and 8th grade at the same Brawley Junior High. In interviews, Levy recognized this, and when Levy pushed the point, Caesar allowed us how possibly the number represented the total of all the schools that he and all of his siblings had attended. But the exaggeration served a point. It served as a way to dramatize the hardships of the migrant life, the toll that it took on families and children, and the utter lack of interest that schools had in educating Mexican-American children. When Chavez referred to his years in the Navy, which is a picture of him in the Navy, he said that he enlisted as a 17-year-old in 1944 and left in 1946, backdating his service by 2 years. The earliest reference to this that I could find comes in 1962 when he was organizing that first convention of the Farm Workers Union. Still struggling to burnish his credentials and win supporters, pushing back his service by 2 years allowed Chavez to present himself as a war veteran, a detail he judged might enhance his stature. And Levy quotes him in the book as saying the country was at war and that he had enlisted because he would have been drafted had he not volunteered. Chavez's account of meeting Fred Ross in San Jose and joining the CSO, and then his account of leaving the organization a decade later, are particularly good examples of revisionist history that have become accepted fact. In Chavez's telling, when Ross came to the house the first time to meet him, Chavez dodged him for days. Then he recruited a bunch of tough friends and told him he would give a signal by switching his cigarette from one hand to the other, and they were then to give Ross a hard time and drive him out of the house. But, Chavez said, Ross spoke such perfect Spanish and was so compelling that Caesar forgot all about the plan and found himself listening rapt to the account of what the CSO had already accomplished and the idea of what that power might mean for his own neighborhood in San Jose. In fact, Ross spoke almost no Spanish. The tough guys were a fabrication. The meeting took place with Chavez's family and a few close friends. Ross was late the first night, but returned the next weekday. Ross, no stranger himself to the concept of inventing a good story to help with an organizing campaign, noted in his journal that he was quite tickled the first time he heard Chavez recount his version of their original meeting. So then Ross obligingly helped the story along by telling Levy that the day he met Chavez, he had gone home and written in his diary, quote, "I think I found the guy I've been looking for." His actual journal entry, which is in the Stanford Library archives, is no less interesting, but not quite as good a soundbite. What he really wrote was, Chavez has real push, understanding, loyalty, enthusiasm, grassroots leadership qualities. And yet, the whole fictionalized account of this meeting can still be found in the online California Department of Education curriculum required as part of California's Cesar Chavez Day holiday, and take it straight from Jacques Levy's book. Last, I want to zero in on Chavez's fateful decision in the spring of 1962 to walk away from a relatively well-paying and secure job as the director of the CSO and move to Delano with the quixotic goal of forming a union for farm workers, something that had never been done. This is, to me, one of his bravest moments. And his letters from Delano to Fred Ross during that time period when he starts to organize are just incredibly revealing and in terms of his strategy and also his vulnerability. The impetus for his departure from the CSO has been described often and unequivocally. Chavez wanted to organize farm workers, and the CSO, dominated by middle-class leaders from urban areas, refused. After he proposed a farm worker campaign one last time at the March 1962 CSO convention and was rebuffed, Chavez resigned. So I confess that in some of my early writings, including my first book, I too repeated this story, never even considering that it might be off base. It was only when I began to research the biography did I actually go back and look for minutes of the CSO convention, which exist and are quite detailed. And in fact, the CSO adopted a 3-stage plan to organize farm workers at that meeting, up to and including supporting or even creating a labor union. The minutes are really clear. A wealthy supporter put up $50,000 for the campaign on the condition that Chavez lead the effort. Chavez stood up on the convention floor and said he was resigning and gave no explanation other than to deny rumors that it was because of the conflict with the president of the organization. His real reasons for resigning from the CSO were complicated. There were personality clashes, there were philosophical differences, and a lack of control made his position increasingly untenable. But it was so much simpler and cleaner to say they refused to organize farm workers. After this discovery, I became so skeptical of Chavez's accounts of his past that when he told Levy that between leaving CSO and moving to Delano, he took his family on a vacation to a beach along the central coast of California, I discounted the story and I didn't put it in my book as I was writing. Chavez almost never took vacations, and it sounded like another romanticized version of reality. Just as I was completing the manuscript, I spent a week in the archives of the Reuther Library going through hundreds of photographs, and they're sort of akin to the picture that I showed of the box of cassettes. There are just drawers of pictures, and they're a huge jumble. And it's sort of like a treasure hunt to go through them because people sent pictures there from all over. There are the Philippines government's official photos from Chavez's visit to the Philippines as a guest of Ferdinand Marcos in 1977. There are snapshots taken by volunteers. There are portraits by professional photographers. And amid the files, I found this small series of little black and white photos, of which this is, oh, that's not one, of which that is one, with Helen Chavez's neat handwriting on the back, identifying each of the children who were playing on the beach in Carpinteria on Easter Sunday in 1962. So I had to revise my chapter at the last moment. There's another picture. In later years, as Chavez's stature grew, he did not need the help of a Jacques Levy when he wanted to color a story. He was able to simply deny inconvenient truths. He had such devoted followers that those who knew better kept quiet. Even those who had been cast out of the movement, and there were plenty, did not speak up for fear of hurting a cause that they believed in so deeply. Chavez denied in interviews that his staff played the Sinanon game, an encounter group therapy he imported to La Paz, the isolated compound in the Tehachapi Mountains that Chavez had chosen as the union's headquarters, now a national park. He denied that he had spearheaded the Illegals campaign in 1974, when union staff were directed to root out and report to the INS for deportation farm workers who lacked legal papers. He denied that his cousin ran a wet line along the Arizona border, where UFW patrols beat up Mexicans without legal papers who were trying to cross to find work. And yet, he saved memos, minutes, and tapes of meetings where all these matters were discussed at length. He even saved tapes of the executive board members playing the game. We have one of them right here with us today. By 1977, there was little doubt that the union was Cesar Chavez, and despite his frequent threats to leave and move on to his next endeavor, forming a poor people's union, there was little chance that that would happen. In 1977, the UFW adopted March 31st as an official holiday, Founders Day, because Chavez said he had left the CSO on his birthday in 1962 in order to found the Farm Workers Union. In fact, he announced his resignation on the convention floor on March 18th, and his official letter was dated in April, but from then on, his birthday was celebrated as Founders Day, and union staff were instructed to take time out to read from Jacques Levy's book and to reflect on Chavez's decision and commitment. And this is a picture of the first Founders Day, actually. It's Cesar's 50th birthday. His wife, Helen, next to him, and his mother, Juana, on the other side. By the time of his death, the union had been in decline for a decade and lost almost all of its contracts. There was little left of the farm worker movement, though Chavez had become the best-known face of what was left of the Chicano movement, and he was a popular speaker, particularly on college campuses. Yet his influence on a generation was profound. When he died in 1993, 40,000 people traveled to Delano for his funeral. Since then, the union has never again returned to the fields with any strength, and his family has largely worked to capitalize on the founder's name and raise money for various nonprofits and enterprises. Fortunately, Chavez was as committed to preserving history as his heirs have been to sanitizing the record. The documents and audio tapes he saved reveal the many sides of a man set on changing the world. Inspiring and profane, dreamy and pragmatic, nurturing and ruthless, clear in his vision and confused about his course. He told jokes and quoted Mao. He extolled the benefits of carrot juice and worm farms. He fought with his brother, and he cursed his closest associate. Chavez's life should serve as a source of inspiration and provoke spirited conversation and debate about choices, tactics, and fate. Was his degree of sacrifice necessary to be an effective organizer? What are the true costs of such commitment? When does hero worship morph into cult of personality? What are the consequences of that? Was he a product of his times? Could a similar movement succeed today? Is a charismatic leader necessary to effect monumental change? How can a movement preserve democracy and yet continue to move forward? And how can a movement transition into a lasting organization? So I want to end with one anecdote that I think says a lot about Chavez and also something about my own work. In 1969, after his first fast, Chavez had increasing problems with his back. He'd always had a bad back, and the fast apparently exacerbated his back problems, and so he spent a lot of time unable to even sit up in bed. You can't quite see it in this picture because it's cut off, but there's a bar at the top that he's holding onto, and he was unable to sit up in bed without pulling himself up on the bar. And he spent time in hospitals, and he was in traction and all sorts of things, and nothing was making him better. And so finally, one of his nurses arranged for a doctor Dr. Janet Travell, who had been President John F. Kennedy's doctor in the White House, to come to Delano to examine him. And Kennedy had many problems, including back problems, and Travell had treated him for them. So she arrived on a Friday night, which was the night that the union had its weekly meetings, and she watched him walk at a Friday night meeting with great difficulty. And she thought she knew just by watching him walk what the problem was. And the next morning on Saturday, she came to the house, and he was lying in bed. And she told him that he had an extreme case of asymmetry. And most of us are slightly asymmetrical, and he was extremely so. And that was what was causing his pain. And that the solution was actually fairly simple, because you put like something in one of your shoes and you straighten out the person, and that he needed to sit in rocking chairs and keep moving and do various other exercises. And he had expected her to say that he needed some dramatic hospital treatment. So he's elated by this news, and he calls in people to hear, and he calls in his brother, and she looks at his brother Richard, who was also a board member of the union at the time, and she looks at him and she says, "You're a little bit uneven too, but not as much." And Cesar says, "We're freaks, we could be in a circus," and he's just thrilled with this. And then she also tells him that he has a Venus de Milo foot, which is when your second toe is longer than your first toe. And it's called that because Michelangelo sculpted Venus de Milo with that sort of a foot. And it's thought to be a sign of great beauty, but it actually in mere mortals causes a lot of pain when you walk, and that was also contributing to his problem. So how do I know all of this? I know all of this because I sat at that tape recorder, and I took out this box that said Travell on it, and I knew that was the name of the doctor, but I didn't know it was on it. And I put it in the tape recorder, and there was a tape recording of the entire 2-hour examination and conversation when Travell comes to examine him on Saturday morning. And so I will end with this thought, which is, what occurred to me when I was listening to it, which is, what kind of a person, what sense of your own history to be in extreme pain like that, and to have the presence of mind when John F. Kennedy's doctor comes to examine you, that you turn on the tape recorder before she starts the examination. And that is Cesar Chavez. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful talk, Miriam. I'll open up the floor for anyone who wants to comment. Eliseo, if you'd like to comment, or if anyone has questions.
I have a question. So you're probably familiar with Professor Matt Garcia's book, Snatching Defeat from the Jaws of Victory, which was highly critical and seemed to conclude that there was very little gained ultimately in terms of the contracts and benefits, etc. I'm just wondering where you might differ with Professor Garcia.
Matt's book ends in 1978. There's a whole history after that. I think that there's a legacy that is important, and that Chavez's role ultimately is greater outside of the fields than his legacy in the fields. It is true that the Union, and I came into this story through journalism, and I wrote stories about what the UFW had become today, and that was what got me involved in the history. And the reality is that that a lot of what happened ultimately undid a lot of what had been accomplished. But there are parts of the legacy that survive, and one of them, which I didn't talk about at all in this talk, is the California has the only law in the country that actually protects the rights of farm workers to organize and to form unions. It's the Agricultural Labor Relations Act, which was passed and signed by Governor Jerry Brown in his first time as our governor, and he's now in his third term. And it is probably the most pro-labor law in the country, and it's still there. It has not been weakened. In fact, it's been strengthened. And so there is a lot that I think is still there, and I think that it's a complex story, and it has a lot of it's hard to oversimplify it.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about both his stance on immigration and sort of the myth of how he represents now something else for immigration. I think it has a lot to do with the way that Hispanics now are identified with maybe a pro-immigration stance, but maybe not back then. And so I've heard a lot of controversy in terms of the way that he's received by people who are immigrants versus people who maybe have many generations in this country.
So yeah, it's I think his stance on immigration is quite complicated. He has the right likes to say that he was the original Minuteman, and that is an extreme position that I don't particularly endorse. But he did have a strong position about the presence of illegal immigrants being it was colored at the time as we're not going after illegal immigrants, we're going after strike breakers. But the reality was that the illegals campaign and the wet line didn't distinguish between people who were coming to break strikes, of which there weren't that many strikes going on at the time, really. And so there was a lot of opposition to it at the time. Even on the tapes, Dolores Huerta, who is the chief apologist for Cesar's position on immigrants at this moment in time, she says on the tapes, maybe we shouldn't use the term wetbacks, because some people really find that offensive. And he just sort of shouts her down. The National Lawyers Guild refused in the summer of 1974 to send summer interns to work for the UFW because they didn't want them to take any part in this. So it was controversial even at the time. That said, the border was very different then. Immigration was a very different issue then. There were some strong feelings in the fields among some workers about people coming to break the strike and being important. Growers did go and bring immigrants from Mexico to break the strikes. I personally think that that to understand it requires also sort of understanding Chavez's position about immigrants, and I think his feelings about immigrants were very complicated. He was not an immigrant, he was a Mexican American. The CSO focused on Mexican Americans, it did not focus on immigrants. Tony Orendine, who was one of the early leaders of the UFW, who was an immigrant and was one of the only immigrants in the ranks of the first generation of Farm Worker Association leaders, never was comfortable. I mean, there was always a tension between him and Cesar. And to me, it goes back to a fundamental, he had a fundamental disdain for the middle class and for people who wanted to be middle class. And he talks a lot about the need to educate workers, to understand the importance of sacrifice, and to understand the importance of continuing to help those who are less fortunate. And a lot of this comes from his experiences in CSO. And I think he understood, I mean, immigrants come to make money. That was why they came. That was one of the primary, many immigrants came and needed to make money to send money back home as well as to support themselves. And he understood that, and I think for him that posed an extra hurdle. He understood that to convince people that making money was not the primary goal that they should be concerned about was going to be sort of I don't know, am I making that, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, I imagine that it was very complex, but I think, I guess my question was more about just like the way that he's remembered today, and how it's sort of glossed over. If you could talk anything about like the myth of that. I mean, I think it's more complicated the way that immigration has changed and become politically.
Right.
But I just wanted to throw that out there that's.
It's completely glossed over today, and I mean, I got asked a lot about it when the book came out, and I tried to put it in context because I think it is easy to oversimplify it. But again, I mean, as a historian, I don't think denying that it happened helps. I think it's more important to understand what happened and why.
I have a question, but before that, I mean, I think that if you historicize this as you did, it's much more understandable. I mean, you mentioned David Gutierrez. I mean, his book is really
Right.
a book about how there's been a long history of this tension between Mexicans and Mexican Americans. I mean, in a way, as a historian, I would say what's striking is how in the present moment, in the last few decades, but not very many, this has changed. But there, and so it seems to us natural to think that there's no distinction worth making, or that anyone will make, right? I would even dare to say, time will tell. I mean, whether this is a sort of joining that is permanent or not. I mean, and this is what you learn as a historian. The things that seem unthinkable now were not unthinkable 30, 40 years ago. And in fact, people defend them very strongly. So the way in which that distinction between Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans has lost any kind of bite. It's really a very recent phenomenon, and in fact, one can imagine, I don't wish for this, but I mean, one can imagine turns of events over the next few decades that could rekindle it in some way. I mean, and so I think Chavez very much fits in the kind of long history of this kind of tension that David Gutierrez shows. But my question, now that was just, my question was, as a historian, I mean, about your sources. I mean, it's a fascinating thing, truly, and it's just the way that he documented nearly everything. I mean, it raises so many questions. And were you able to look at all of this? I mean, is there a lot there that remains to be explored by other people?
The family put an objection to you?
Yeah.
So, well, the family, I'm not their favorite person, so they did not cooperate with me, but I knew that going in, and I knew that I didn't need I could do it because of the amazing amount of material that was there, and I mean, I have not gone through everything. I mean, there are just hundreds of boxes, and they're the collection is just like terribly organized, so you almost, I could almost get to the point where, looking through any box, I could find something that was really interesting, which was not necessarily what I had pulled that box out to look for. I don't know. I mean, I kind of at some point was like, okay, I can't, spend my life on this. There's a lot of duplication because, I mean, it was also, God bless the people who invented those forms, like in triplicate, like, there used to be, for those of you young people, it used to be that you filled things out and there were like 2 carbon copies of everything, so they're just like copies of things in multiple places, and people had to, do, what do you call them, mimeograph machines, right? Is that, Eliseo, you can help me here, mimeograph, right?
NCR paper, that's what we call it.
NCR paper?
The one in triplicate.
Insight. I mean, this is what I would, into this obsessive documentation. I mean, you said a little about it, because it seems to me that if you take the model of, people who knowingly mythologize themselves for often perfectly valid, good reasons, right? I mean, that the tendency is rather the opposite. I mean, you actively erase any, and then you can go from dictators the world over to, leaders, that is to say, if you had not had access to any of these documents, then you would probably be thinking that that autobiography of La Causa was pretty straightforward. I mean, after all, it came out of his mouth. Why would anybody say he went to 37 schools if he didn't? I mean, I can tell you as a historian, I would never question that. That's a fact. He said it himself, right? And so, can you say something about this? Because it is remarkable,
But I mean, then there were people who do save everything, and it's a different kind of person. I mean, why did Richard Nixon save the tapes? And the taping thing, he was fast, and I think also, I don't know. I mean, you can jump in here, but he, he read about Machiavelli, he read about Mao, he read about Gandhi, who I didn't even mention, who was it, and so I think to some degree, his role models were people who, were complicated people and were good and even, there's a quote that I often use that is in the book where he said, nice guys don't change the world. And, it takes a hard-headed person, and it's a Spanish word, but and so I think he saw himself in that way. I mean, I don't think, and he wanted it saved. There are some people, and in my work, in going through the archives of people, in my first book, which was a collective portrait of 8 people in the movement, partly I picked the people who kept records, although not all of them did. So, and I found again, like some people save everything and some people don't. Luis Valdez, the founder of the Teatro Campesino, who started on the picket lines in Delano and all, Luis's archives, he cut out everything, every single thing. And so I think there's certain people who have a sense of their own importance in history and save things. And the tape recordings, I mean, and he lied, but he people would say, his lawyers would say, I hope you're destroying this tape because, just the way we have access to what the Teamsters are doing, someday somebody's going to sue us. And he said, oh, we just use them to do the minutes of the meetings and then we record over them. And there are recordings from, it stops in about 80 or 81 when there really wasn't that much going on anymore either within the union. But from 70, there's some that starts in the late 60s, and then from 1973 when the union was first formed as an official AFL-CIO union, through about 1980, all of the executive board meetings were taped, and everybody knew they were taped, right? I mean, there's a big tape recorder right in the middle of the room.
Have there been any efforts to digitize or make these more accessible? You said there were some okay, good.
Yes, by me basically, because I got tired of the tape recorder. So I worked with. There's a great audiovisual archivist at Wayne State, and I worked with her, and she found a place that they would send the tapes out, and so a lot of them now exist on CD, and hopefully more of them will in the future. But the reels actually preserve remarkably well. But they're and there are 2 sides to them, and they're recorded at different speeds, and it's really a mess. But they're a great resource. And the other answer to your question is there is more stuff. I did not listen. And I could keep listening forever. I find them just absolutely fascinating. But there's stuff that I didn't listen to, and I think there's a lot more that could be done. I know someone who's working. Was interested in doing a book about the Filipinos in the movement and their relationship, and that's a great book that has not been written, and I think there's a lot still to do.
You know, you posed the talk as the conflict between the man and the myth. What if you took it as the biography and the autobiography? That is how he wants to represent himself over time, and then just the technologies that are around him. Because a lot of the mythology around Cesar Chavez is due to the birth of the television age and the dissemination of news feed that was visual and was entering every household. And Cesar Chavez, like Corky Gonzalez, like Reyes Lopez Tijerina, like Martin Luther King, like Malcolm X, we're seeing their images, essentially paraded into households on a daily basis, or at least a weekly basis. And so, to me, a lot of the celebrity that's created is, in fact, the rapid movement of these images that then allow them to see how their movement is actually benefiting from these television images that are then bringing more people to their assemblies and their crowds, and thus, leading to the mythologies that they create about themselves as they progress through age, because memory is never static. Memory is constantly changing. So he could have been right in saying that, when he was 18, he did this because that's what his memory, fixated on, but doesn't necessarily mean it was inaccurate. Well, according to you, it's inaccurate because it doesn't square with his military service record. And I've seen lots of that stuff in working with historical records. And sometimes people remember things very differently than they're recorded in court transcripts, or that they're recorded in photographs. And sometimes the photographs become the source of the memory that in fact has evaporated, and they only know about it because of the photograph.
I think, those are all good points, and I think that, people's memories are notoriously inaccurate, and I didn't quote anyone in the book because I interview people, and I don't, and I sort of interviewed them for background, but I didn't use the quotes. But the junctures that I focused on were places where I thought, he deliberately changed his story and shaped it for a reason. It wasn't because he forgot or because he got confused. There was a reason why he wanted to present his decision to leave CSO, or the story of meeting Fred. It served a use, and it served a real use. And as Amelia said, mythologies can be very useful. Yeah. I just think that, as historians, we need to differentiate and to show. What I tried to do in the book, and I think in some ways this is partially answer also to your question about how does my work differ from Matt Garcia's. I don't see it as a gotcha. I'm not trying to say, he did this and whatever. I'm trying to write about it in a way that shows, why he did this, and yet, where he did diverge from what seems to be documented reality.
Well, all right, since you invited me, I just want to make a couple of comments, if I may. I first met Cesar when I was 19 years old. I was one of those that went to the union meeting. I was a farm worker, and I got carried away with it. And I spent the next 13 years of my life working as an organizer and a boycott organizer. That's how I knew Chicago, because I was one of those that was sent here to stop the sale of grapes. I wish they had told me that the winters are cold, but they didn't. And when I left, I was the second vice president of the union. And there's a couple of comments I would just make. One is in response to what the judge said. I think it's a mistake to look at the accomplishments of Cesar and the union within the context of the fields only. I think that what that movement did at a critical time in history, it gave Latinos, Chicanos, Mexicans, an ability that they could, in fact, organize, stand up, and fight for themselves. And you can see the influence of the Farm Workers Union in today's immigrant rights movement. Si Se Puede, the marches, the going out and signing people out to come out and vote, the voter registration drives. It's all stuff that happened through the CSO strategy. So the contributions and the development of leaders and organizers in the union go beyond the fields. Now they're in cities and all over the country. People are working as organizers. They're professionals. They're just the influences that can be felt everywhere. And I think that's one of the major contributions. The second thing is the question about the definitive look, because the union and the movement was broader than just Cesar Chavez. So a lot of the records in Wayne State detail what went on in Chicago, in Boston, in Toronto, Canada, because we all basically ran our own little organizations with their own strategies, and the full picture of what the movement did and accomplished has never been told, because it obviously the focus has been on Cesar Chavez as the leader rather than on the movement itself. And what was accomplished is quite remarkable, I think, everywhere. You know, when we were here in Chicago, for example, out of that movement came the Illinois Historical Labor Society. Some of the young muralists that came out were also involved with the boycott and developed into people doing a lot of wonderful work here in Chicago and Illinois, and the same thing happened all over the country. And I'll just say that one of the things about Cesar is he was a master strategist and a genius at organizing. He had this ability to make you believe that you can do more than what you yourself think you can do. And with all of the problems, and Miriam has done a wonderful job of capturing some of the difficult times and the dark times within the life of the union. She knows more about the Farm Workers Union than I or anybody else knows, because she's actually devoted a lot part of her life to researching it. But I tell you that most of us, with all of the mixed feelings that we have, if we have to do it over again, we probably go and do it over again. Because it was such a rich, rewarding experience for us as individuals. And I think in the greater scheme of things, that it made a huge contribution to this country. And it also taught us that leaders are also human beings, no better and no worse, with the same failings and the same strengths as any other human being. And the failings should not obscure the positive contribution.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with all of that, and I think that, Alicia, would you agree that the book also captures the good parts?
Oh,
Okay, so
absolutely.
I focused the time. I was trying to be, and that is Chicago, 1967, right? When you just right after you got here for the boycott. So in Union of Their Dreams, Eliseo is one of the protagonists in Union of Their Dreams. So there's a lot in there about Chicago and about the boycott. And I focused the talk on the myth and the man, and I don't want that to overshadow the fact that I agree with everything that Eliseo said, and I think and that's why he's worthy of a book, a biography, and why his story is important, and why also the reason that I got into this after writing the newspaper stories was because of meeting people like you and a whole generation of people who had come out of the movement and were sort of 30 years later, still, both practicing what they had learned and part of that legacy, and also still haunted by this question of what went wrong and why did the union not turn into a sustainable labor union for farm workers. And so that was what got me involved in the history, was trying to sort of figure that out and wanting to understand this force that was so powerful that it had produced this generation of activists, and that people were still kind of consumed by, could we have done something differently, and where did it go off the tracks, and what was Cesar really thinking, and why did he do this? And so I thought that there was kind of a rich vein, and I would also agree with everything. I've never met anyone who worked for the UFW for any period of time, no matter how short, and no matter the circumstances under which they left, many of which were not pleasant, who does not say that it was the most important and formative time of their life, and that they would do it over again.
So now, I just wanted to follow up on that. We looked at from today that the historic effort to organize farm workers, despite the significant, enormous victories of that moment, didn't go well.
Right.
Right? I mean, if you look at farm workers today, now Eliseo Medina is talking about the fundamental importance of this for Latinos in helping teach people to organize, and you could organize, but it seems that shifted for various reasons, of which some of which had to do with Chavez himself, some of which did not have to do with Chavez, in a different direction, right? I mean, into more urban spaces, into, and so in a way there's an irony, right? Because some of the drive of this now has to do actually with working with immigrants, mainly in cities and suburbs and other places, right? So, and away because of the difficulty of it, from the farm workers who were the original inspiration of this, so that the center of gravity has moved away in a direction that Chavez would have hardly imagined, it seems to me, partly because of the divide that was typical of the time that he made between farm workers on the one hand and immigrants who may be undocumented on another one. That seems to be now, I mean, if I think of labor unions like the one that he's associated with and others and so on, I mean, that seems to be where the action is now, where the battles are now, and yet it seems at the same time. So the question, I mean, I wanted a comment on that, but also the question is, so, I mean, it's counterfactual, so I know it has no answer, but is ultimately the difficulty with organizing farm workers, maybe exacerbated by Chavez's own sense that he wanted to go in a different direction, by his own desire to control it, or can we imagine a different path with, another person there, or a different set of Chavez, where the movement to organize farm workers would have continued to progress in a different direction? That is to say, because what's remarkable, I mean, Chavez is in the stamps, and Obama talks about him, but if you look at the plight of farm workers today, you'd say, well, isn't that ironic? So is it really ultimately, and this is what I'm trying to organize, think about the historic importance of Chavez, was the wall that they hit, despite Cesar's own failings, which everybody has, and so on, one that was bound to be hit because it really had to do with much bigger factors, or was it one that was largely, or at least in good measure, the product of his own, or the kinds of things you talk about it?
So I would argue the latter, and that's the argument that I did. In Union of Their Dreams, that was the focus. It was the rise and the fall of the movement. Now, would it have continued into the 1990s? I don't know. But I certainly think that it was cut short by his own actions, without question. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do think that at some point there will be another organizer, because unfortunately the growers are just as greedy as they were back then, and by their own actions they're making the rise of another farm worker movement inevitable. There's lots of that going on. I still have relatives that are working in the fields of California. Unfortunately, I think those efforts were set back by what happened at the latter part of the movement. And maybe, when you were talking, the irony of it, Miriam, see what you think about this, is that he was talking towards the end, when I was still there, about a poor people's union that was more urban in nature than agriculture. And to some degree,
That's what's happening.
That's what's beginning to happen with the immigrant rights movement. And I'm just whether that's...
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think to some degree he saw, but he gave a speech it's almost exactly 30 years ago at the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco in November of 1984. And by then, the union was really, he had driven out all of the strong people. There's a whole episode, which I go into a lot of detail in the first book, where there was real leadership that came out of the fields, and there was the potential of a really farm worker-led union that was based in Salinas, and he just got rid of all those people. So, now what would have happened there in 10 or 15 years, who knows? But certainly there was a point at which something was happening and it was cut short. So by 1984, there's really not much going on in terms of farm workers at all. And he gives this speech at the Commonwealth Club, which gets quoted a lot, and I open the book with it because, in a way, it's a eulogy for his own union. And what he sort of says, he doesn't present it this way. He presents it that we were up against these formidable obstacles, and we're going to continue, and we're going to come back. But what he says is it doesn't matter anymore. whether we have contracts, whatever, I could die tomorrow and it doesn't make any difference, because what we have shown is that the poorest people with the fewest resources can do this and can organize and can change their lives and can change the world. And that model is now being seen in the cities. So he saw in '84 already that it was spreading to the cities. And I think that's part of his visionary, I think he really played things out. I mean, Eliseo said how he was a master strategist, and he was. And he really played things out far into the future, much better than most people do. And one of the things he said in that speech was, in 25 and 30 years, the cities of California are going to be run by people who look like me, and people who are the children and the grandchildren of farm workers. And he was absolutely right, and I don't think there are not a lot of people who, in 1984 in San Francisco, who would have said that. So to some degree, I think he did see that that was the case.
One of the, in the mythologies that exist, I've certainly seen books and articles galore on Cesar Chavez, the Gandhi aspirant, Cesar Chavez, the penitential, reverent, conservative Catholic. I've never seen much about anything of reading of Mao and inspiration from Mao.
Yeah,
so I'm curious. Because these myths start with Jacques Levy's The Autobiography of La Causa. So I'm curious to what extent really he was religious, and that motivated his movement, because the Virgin of Guadalupe was always there, the standard bearer at the top. His march to Sacramento was a penitential pilgrimage. His masses were always said at strike events. So I'm wondering how much is, you started with the man and the myth.
Yeah.
I wonder how much is the myth.
So, I can't, I've been both criticized and praised for not getting inside his head in this book, so it depends on people's point of view. Because I don't like to take things beyond what I don't speculate about people's psyches. It was both, I think. He was religious. Catholicism is a very important, it's a cultural part of Mexican Catholicism, as you know, is something that is an important identity even for Catholics who don't go to church and who are not religious. And so he certainly understood the importance of that, and he used it. He also, he did believe in sacrifice. He did march, he did fast, he did put his own body on the line in ways that were very powerful as an organizing tool. And he went to jail. And you can talk to people still today who say, I wasn't sure what I thought about him, but he was willing to go to jail for us, and he was willing to march, and he was willing to do this stuff, and it was very powerful. The march, there were some things. This is going to get a little bit off the answer, but I think it'll get to you. So some parts of this book, I was writing about the same events that I wrote about in my first book, but the first book is told from the perspective of Eliseo and 7 other people who were part of the movement, and it's sort of their story, and you see Cesar through their eyes. And so in some cases in this book, I was recounting the same events, but from Cesar's perspective in a sense. And so one of those was when the law passes that we were talking about, which was this incredibly powerful tool for organizing, and really, again, to your point, when the law passed, there were hundreds of elections, and there was this pent-up demand, and then the union falls apart because it can't administratively deal with negotiating and administering those contracts. It's what Chavez calls non-missionary work. It's not what he's interested in, and that's when the sort of real tensions begin that are all captured on these tapes. So when the law passes, it's a whole new ball game. People are running around, Eliseo's in Oxnard, everybody's being sent out to figure out how to organize these elections and how to play by these rules, which are now the state's rules as opposed to Cesar's rules. And he decides he takes this march. He marches from San Diego up the length of the state. He calls it the 1,000-mile march. And when I wrote The Union of Their Dreams, all the people in there were like, what the hell? We're out here doing all this organizing, and he's marching, and the lawyers are saying every time we need to find him to answer a question, we have to go find him on the march, and, what was he thinking?
Well, wasn't he seeing black marches on TV?
Yeah, but the reason I mentioned the march is because for him, it was a powerful organ, because when I studied the march in terms of Cesar as opposed to the other people, you see what a powerful organizing tool it was and how it drew people out. And so, you know, all of that was real. And his suffering, he leaned into the suffering and he leaned into the religion, but it was real too. So it was both. It was an image and it was real.
And the Gandhi?
He was really an admirer and a student of Gandhi. He really believed in Gandhi's power to mobilize people and Gandhi's power to get people to do what he wanted. He also was very interested in collective living. I mean, ultimately what he goes off into, you know, the sort of the Poor People's Union and all that is part of forming collectives. And he sees collectives as the answer to how do you tell people not to aspire to be middle class. That, you know, we have to find ways to provide for people that are comfortable. So the whole idea of the ashram and the community and all that, he was really into that.
Hey, just add to your question on Gandhi. If you look at the strategies that we pursued, and I didn't even know that until later when I started reading, Gandhi organized the March to the Sea in the UFW with the March to Sacramento. Gandhi organized the salt boycott, the great boycott. He fasted, so did Caesar. And so a lot of the strategy, he was a student of history. So when he read a lot of those strategies that were done, and Gandhi pioneered the movement, you know, then a lot of those things you see that you look at it in the farm workers movement. The other thing I would just add to the question of Catholicism, when you poor, powerless, and you have nothing, in order to take on the powerful, you need, the only thing you got is faith. And what greater ally than God to be with you, to reassure you that eventually you will win because you are right. And so to some degree, along with his own personal faith, it was also important, you know, when we had the first strike meeting, it was at Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. Very symbolic. And it was also on September 16th. For those of you who don't know, it's Mexican Independence Day. Independence and faith together when you were talking about taking on a powerful adversary. Okay. None of us would have ever thought we could defeat them, but it gave us that sense of belief. And so whenever there was something, you always saw the Virgin of Guadalupe leading the March to Sacramento. You always had priests and putting us up in churches or ministers, people coming, you had nuns going to jail with us. It was always that faith sustaining us. So it was both, I think, also part of what I said, master strategist, in a way make you believe and reassure at the same time.
I suppose I have a follow-up question related. Do you see like evidence of any of his relationship with liberation theology as that's developing alongside him?
It's a good question. I don't, but it doesn't mean it's not there. It's just not something I've come across, but it sort of makes sense in terms of the time period.
Anything else? Well, we want to thank Miriam for coming to give a very inspirational talk. For I plug the new book. It's easily available on Amazon.com and probably at the seminary bookstore. And please join me in thanking Miriam for joining us.